Assalamu alaikum, friends of Bookbytes. In this weekend's edition, we've got a really interesting new work by Professor Saleem Badat of the UFS, Tennis, Apartheid and Social Justice. I've been reading through this book, and it actually documents, it's a very exemplary research document of the first non-racial international tennis tour in 1971. And now what's interesting is, I mean, we look back on documentation of apartheid times and how various talents of non-white players had been sort of restricted in so many ways, even when there was international recognition for their talent, for the level of work that was being presented. In 1971, the non-racial South African Lawn Tennis Union sent 6 promising young players on a historic tour to play tournaments in Europe. The team was known as the Dheeraj squad after national champion Jasmat Dheeraj. Apartheid South Africa in the 70s, as we know, was a racist and repressive society based on white supremacy and privilege and black oppression. Black tennis players were denied proper facilities, coaching, opportunities to excel, and the chance to represent their country and play international tournaments. They could not belong to the same clubs as whites or compete in competitions with or against white players. And despite these barriers and constraints, many sportspersons and administrators courageously and with determination pursued the ideals of non-racialism in sport and in wider society. So what this book does is it records political, social, and sporting conditions associated with the 1971 tour, the adventures of the talented young black players, the impact of the tour on them, and the lessons learned. It documents the collusion of international tennis associations with the racist white apartheid government and white-only South African tennis body that prevented the Dheeraj squad member, Mr. Hassim Badat, the opportunity to play in the junior Wimbledon championships despite qualifying. And the book contends that there's been neither recognition nor reparations for outstanding apartheid-era black sportspersons, and yet the apartheid legacy continues to impinge powerfully on tennis today. Professor Saleem Badat is a research professor in humanities at UKZN and now at UFS. He played tennis under the non-racial tennis bodies. He was Natal Junior Tennis Singles and Double Champion in 1972 and 73. He has many books under his belt. And I look forward now to chatting to him. Welcome, Professor Saleem Badat, and champion, the 1971 tennis champion, Mr. Hassim Badat, as well online. Welcome to the show. Welcome to both of you on the show this evening.
Thank you for having us, Shafinaaz. Pleasure.
Speak to us about how this book was configured, the basis for your research, if we can get into that, Professor Badat, and obviously your vision for documenting this particular time in apartheid tennis history.
Okay, so the way the book came about is very serendipitous. My good friend Hussein, who I've known for 48 years, used to reminisce about this 1971 tour. And at some point, I began making notes and I began thinking that I'll write a short article in 2021, which would have been the 50th anniversary of the tour. And I was really thinking a 900-word newspaper article highlighting the tour, what happened to Hussein, his exclusion from Wimbledon, the collusion, as you mentioned, of the International Lawn Tennis Federation, and so on. And then as I began working on it and doing more research, I had to take an important decision about whether I carry on with this book or I continue with the book that I was already working on, which was on the history of universities in South Africa. And for various reasons, I decided to prioritize this book, and I would do it again. And one of those reasons was that when I looked around me, my good friend Hussein was almost 70. The captain of the tennis squad, Jasmat Dheeraj, who's still alive, is 82 years old and lives in Hampshire in England. And I didn't want to have any regrets, to be honest. I wanted to interview them while I could and really bring their story and the events of 1971 to the greater public. And so that 900-word article eventually became this whole book.
Well, obviously, a very important documentation of that time because readers such as myself, researchers around the country would be able to look at the importance not just of documenting that time, but you say, and rightly so, that reparations haven't been undertaken. But first, let's get into the story. Mr. Baba, tell us a bit about, you know, being a player at the time, being young. You've got this amazing support of your father. I read through some of the letters towards the end, but that feeling of being recognized for your talent, for your hard work, and then, what happens next? Sort of the unfairness of it, the injustices of the time being brought to sport. Speak to us about the particularities of your experience.
So, Shafinaaz, thanks. Just a bit of background. We in South Africa at that time, it was the height of apartheid, and we had separate sports bodies. There was a South African tennis body for the coloreds, for the Indians, for the whites, and the blacks. Now, for us, we had no real facilities. We didn't have any sponsors. We didn't have coaches. Myself and most of us learned from books or from family members. So when I got selected to represent, this was, remember, the first ever non-racial South African team was being sent over. It was a real surreal moment, first of all, to be accepted. It was years and years of practice, hours and hours of sacrifice with playing tennis, physical fitness. So and if you can imagine now getting an opportunity to play in UK and Europe, to be able to play against the best players in the world. So being selected and going on tour was an absolute highlight for me, coming from, like we say, the background of lack of facilities, no sponsors, no equipment sponsors. We often had to travel 50 kilometers just to practice once a week. So getting a chance to play on the greatest stage in the world was an absolute highlight of my tennis career at that stage.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, Professor Badat, if you now situate this in the broader context, because you also speak about not just the tennis association and the young tennis players and their experience, but you speak also about under apartheid times, the experience of golfers, the experience of cricketers. Give us the broader context now, just of both the lack of resources and the injustice of the time. Speak to us a little bit about that context.
So it's important really for younger people who didn't grow up under apartheid to appreciate what apartheid society was in 1971. So let's just go back 10 years. 1961, it was huge repression. The ANC was banned, the PAC was banned, the liberation movement was smashed, people went into exile, people were in the jails, and so on, right? And throughout the 60s into the early 70s, South Africa was incredibly booming economically. And so if you were a white South African during that period, you lived in heaven. If you were a black South African during that period, it was torment. And that played itself out in the sports fields, in the educational arenas, in the health facilities. Everything was segregated, as we know. So today's kids go to school and they take for granted the fact that they sit next to other kids and so on. In those days, that was just not possible. Not in schools, not in hospitals. So the tennis courts and the sports fields were the same. It was segregated by race. And in that context, there was no facilities for black South Africans, no coaching, none of that. So just to keep alive sport, and then on top of that, to play non-racial sport, when you could have accommodated yourself to the scraps that the white unions or the white government was wanting to give you, and lived a perhaps more contented life, at least as a tennis player. But that would have meant turning your back on everyone else. And you would have had to make sacrifices, and you would probably have been ostracized if Hussein had done that, right? So for us, it was very important during that period as young people to become part of non-racial sport. under Hassan Hawa and the South African Council on Sport, and the slogan of no normal sport in an abnormal society. That was a very powerful slogan. It was reminding you that, you cannot imagine you can play sport and learn properly and so on in an abnormal society that we were, because it was predicated on the one hand on white privilege, abundant, and black oppression and repression. So in that context, to have young people like Hussein wasn't even 18 years old when he was selected. One of the other people, Kevin Bergman, was 16 years old. So for the black community to come together to raise the money, it was an enormous amount of money to be spent in 1971 to send the 6 of them. There was no sponsorship or anything of that sort. I make the point that in South Africa, the sugar circuit, the sugar industry on the coast of KwaZulu-Natal used to put a lot of money into white tennis. And some of those people did very well internationally. The last South African to win Junior Wimbledon, which is what was denied to Hussein, was Byron Bertram in 1970. Byron Bertram and Hussein are 1 month apart in terms of birth. But Byron Bertram could go overseas, play at Wimbledon and wherever he wanted, but Hussein couldn't. So that was the context. And the international unions understood what was happening in South Africa, but they wanted to turn a blind eye to that. They wanted white South Africa to be playing sport with them. So in that context, for people like Hussein or others to even have the spirit to play when they knew they could only go to a certain level and they could never represent their country was quite a sacrifice, So that's the context in which, this tour takes place, against a backdrop of real kind of oppression in South Africa and so on. And it's really sacrifices of the black community, small black traders and so on, contributing to the funds to send this 6 people. So it's historic because it's the first time young black South Africans are going overseas to play tennis and to test themselves against other people, irrespective of race, nationality, and so on. The kind of things they couldn't do here. Or if they had wanted to do that here, then they would have had to sell out, in a sense, their principles, and they would have had to become honorary whites in order to play once a year some tournament in South Africa against whites. The kinds of things Arthur Ashe came to do, kind of thing Yvonne Goolagong came from Australia to do. They had to come as honorary whites, which is a terrible indignity.
I mean, documenting these stories also outlines not just a general frustration because you're aware that there's difference, there's barriers under a repressive regime, but understanding that that level of talent is not being recognized locally and it is being recognized overseas, and then suddenly you literally hit a wall. I mean, Mr. Babat, speak to us about those kinds of challenges. Tell us some about some of those internal challenges as a young, talented tennis player, feeling like they've just dropped this bomb and they've closed this door on you. What was that feeling like? And, given that you had a lot of support around you from your community and your family.
So just a bit of background. So when we went on this tour, it was all the tournaments that lead up to Wimbledon. And we arrived there, first of all, it wasn't easy to get away because the background was such that some years before, the first South African black table tennis team and were invited by the world body to represent South Africa. I think it was in Helsinki. But the South African government got wind of that and they took their passports away, which means that they couldn't travel and play against the best in the world. So we had learned from that, and we sort of kept the whole tour low key and arrived in Johannesburg as if we were going on a holiday, all separately, got together at Johannesburg International Airport. Only once we were on the aeroplane, we felt that we now had got away. That was the first part. So it was like, it wasn't just easy going. It was always a bit of a strain whether we were even going to get onto the plane to get there. But once we arrived there, we registered. We got affiliated to the international body via a club in London. And then we played all the tournaments leading up to the Wimbledon. Myself and my colleague Kevin Bergman were the two juniors in the team. I, the South African #1 under-19 junior at the time, and Bergman, the #2. So while on tour, we were told now to apply also for Wimbledon, myself for junior Wimbledon. At that time, the entire draw for Wimbledon, then and now, is handled by the All England Lawn Tennis Club. And for junior Wimbledon, the criteria was that you had to be the #1 under-19 junior in your country. You had to be the national under-19 champion, and also your results for the 12 months preceding that. So I satisfied the criteria. I applied for Wimbledon, and some weeks later, on the tour, I received a telegram. That's how our mail came in those days. No emails and WhatsApp messages. So I received a telegram. And when I opened the telegram, it read, "Congratulations, you have been accepted for Junior Wimbledon 1971. Now, you can imagine reading that. I think I must have read and reread that several times just to make sure that it was addressed to me and whether I was accepted or rejected. So, and that moment, it was like absolutely unreal, thinking that this 18-year-old from a segregated suburb in Durban with no proper coaching, no proper facilities, just sheer determination, practice, hard work, now got a chance to play on the greatest stage in the world, and that's Junior Wimbledon. So at that moment, back home in South Africa, the black tennis fraternity was overjoyed because it gave hope to the people that, despite all the hardships that we had, you can still make it possibly to the chance to play against the best in the world.
Right.
So that happened. But about a week before Wimbledon was about to start, I received another telegram. This time, it was addressed to me by the International Lawn Tennis Federation, which runs tennis then and now. I was requested to attend a meeting about a week before Wimbledon was about to start, and he told me to come with my captain. I didn't know what the meeting was about, but it was to meet a certain Mr. Basil Ray, who was the General Secretary of the International Lawn Tennis Federation at that time. Even though it's 52 years ago, I recall it absolutely vividly, even now. We walking into the office, being greeted by Basil Ray, but in the office, there was another white gentleman who I vaguely recognized, but my captain, Jasmine Diraj, instantly recognized as Alf Chalmers, who was the head of the white, all-exclusive racist tennis body, also at the meeting. So we were shocked. We couldn't understand why he flew all the way from South Africa to attend this meeting of mine with the international lawn tennis head. What he had come here, therefore, was to object to my entry in Junior Wimbledon. And his objections were based on the very ground on which I had been accepted already, meaning that I was the national under-19 #1. I was the holder of the South African under-19 singles. And my results playing in the UK leading up to Wimbledon was satisfactory enough for me to be accepted. So I was accepted already and in the draw. But they objected to say I'm not the official #1 and that my white counterpart, Byron Bertram, was the #1. So fortunately, I had my captain with me, Jasmine Diraj, who was a very strong anti-apartheid activists. And he countered every objection they had to say, first of all, how can you say that when Hussein is not allowed to play with against Byron Bertram in South Africa? I mean, we could be arrested for playing against each other, or me being in a white area. So how would you know that? Secondly, you said we're not allowed to affiliate to your white tennis body, only as honorary white, which to us was an insult. Imagine, who wanted to be an honorary white? So whatever objection that Alf Chalmers raised, we Jasmine counted. In fact, there was no argument really, because I was already accepted and in the draw. But it looks like they had already made up their mind, because after about an hour or so of back and forth, Basil Ray, white colonial master that he was, stood up and would, like a smirk on his face, said, tomorrow I will instruct the All England Club to remove your name from the draw. Just like that, at the stroke of a pen, not because of my ability, but because of the color of my skin, I was removed from the draw and wasn't allowed to play. Because of white racist South Africa objecting to my entry and accepted by the colluding international tennis body. So it was the dream of playing at Wimbledon was shattered by a white colonial master and a racist supremacist from South Africa.
It's absolutely devastating to hear, even when I read this, obviously the individual narratives in the book, but to hear, and the devastation comes through in your tone as you tell the story, almost, half a decade later, half a century later. And I mean, Professor, just to look at, the question that was in my mind the whole time was, how does an international body allow itself to succumb to, a state like South Africa, knowing what was happening, knowing that there was apartheid? There were so many organizations that worked on the anti-apartheid movement. I mean, it shows, obviously, my question is sort of rhetoric in a way, but just clarify this for us, because it just doesn't make sense that of meritocracy, you've got something that's, someone who's been chosen so well, and doesn't it put a blight on an organization like the Wimbledon organizations that say, okay, suddenly we're retracting this invitation for your talent or whatever, just because you're not the right color? It's devastating just to hear this even 50 years later. Speak to us, about that. Clarify that.
So let's start from today. In my view, and that view was endorsed when we had our book launch in London, and we had a message of support from Peter Hain, who, as you know, led the sports campaigns and boycotts in the 1970s. And we had former Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn also speaking at the book launch, right? It's absolutely no doubt that the All England Lawn Tennis Club must issue an apology for what they did in 1971. And it's not a personal apology to Hussein alone. It's an apology to all non-racial sports persons in South Africa for accepting the decision of the International Lawn Tennis Federation. Right? Secondly, the International Lawn Tennis Federation, which is now the ITF, must also apologize for what their colonial general secretary did. And Hussein is quite right to say that the International Tennis Federation go along with that. Did he even speak to them about this issue? Did Wimbledon ask any questions when they were instructed to remove his name? Right? So we are engaging with both those bodies. With the All England Lawn Tennis Club, we are on our 4th letter, and they've replied 3 times. We've had a reply from the International Tennis Federation. We will remind them that we are due another response, that there's enough time they've had, because both of them initially responded to say, we are going to do research on this. I'm happy to say, do as much research as you want.
Right.
But at the end of it, have the courage to apologize for what you did. So that takes us back to your question. During that period, there was shameful collusion between the international tennis federations. And why? Because they were dominated, if you have to put it in a certain way, by the Western countries, right? The US, France, Germany, America, and so on. They had more votes than anyone else in these committees. So the campaigning to exclude tennis, table tennis, cricket, and so on was going on from the 1950s. But they were simply ignoring that, because you must remember, those governments in London and in Washington and so on were by and large supporters of apartheid. Nelson Mandela, we must be remembered, was a terrorist in their eyes, right? So the exclusion from sport, the collusion that was happening in sport, was part and parcel of the collusion that was happening between the United States, Germany, France, the UK, Israel, and South Africa in order to subjugate and suppress blacks. So what they were doing on the sports field was minor compared to the other kinds of collusion around the repression of black South Africans. Where was all the military armaments and all coming to South Africa from to repress black South Africans? From those countries. Okay. So the sports boycott only really gets momentum as African countries become independent, as India and other countries become independent. And they start campaigning that and forcing the international unions to acknowledge that there's apartheid in South Africa. So what the international federations were doing, last word, is they were violating the Olympic Charter also. The Olympic Charter says you cannot perpetrate racism or practice racialism or racial prejudice. And they were violating that shamefully.
But you also rightfully say that reparations haven't been undertaken after all these years. And so it's not just within the sporting bodies themselves, but what has our government done to bring some justice?
Exactly. So when Nelson Mandela says, like he says in 1995, that, you know, the only way we're going to heal in South Africa is through a lot of honesty. Well, there's no honesty, because as you say, 52 years on, we have not had any recognition for people like Hussein and the Diraj brothers and Kevin Bergman and others. We haven't had any recognition for most non-racial sportsmen and sportswomen, let alone reparations or restitution. That is shameful. Right. From a democratically elected government and the new tennis body post-1994. Up to today, we are waiting for the Tennis Association of South Africa to respond to our letter to say, what are you going to do in this situation? Are you going to engage the International Tennis Federation to issue an apology? They were there in Wimbledon, the president of the Tennis Association of South Africa. Haven't heard from him yet. Not even the decency. This Tennis Association of South Africa that's meant to represent us doesn't have even the decency to respond to a letter around an important issue of recognition, reparations, and restitution. They have not recognized any non-racial South African tennis player. That is shameful.
Certainly disgraceful. Thank you, Professor Badat and Mr. Badat, for, clarifying and outlining, but especially really highlighting the significance of this book. And I think this launch is just the beginning of this journey to perhaps forcefully engage and continue to seek justice and reparations for what has happened over 50 years ago. We're 30 plus years into a so-called democratic and post-apartheid society, and we're still not seeing these reparations in place, and the need is more dire now than ever. So really thank you for your time this evening. Thank you and congratulations on this book being out there. I have no doubt that you will see traction, and this is really a piece of social justice right here in the form of a publication. Once again, thank you for your time this evening to both of you.
Thank you for hosting us.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Salam.
Walaikum salam. And so there you have it this evening. We spoke to Professor Saleem Badat and Mr. Hassim Badat about tennis, apartheid, and social justice. Be sure to get yourselves a copy. Let's continue the debate, and you stand a chance to win a copy of the book later on our socials. Assalamu alaikum this evening from the Bookbytes team.